Rain trembled against the tall windows of the Hotel Moreau as midnight carried its slow heartbeat through the Rue des Martyrs. Somewhere beyond the shutters, Paris was dissolving under a curtain of mist, the sort that turns lamplight into halos and footsteps into whispers. Inside, Inspector Moreau stood before a canvas leaned against the wall. A portrait of a family long dead, their painted eyes gleaming with a polish that seemed freshly wet. Someone had cleaned it, or perhaps someone had touched it from within. The faces on the canvas, the patriarch, the mother, the boy between them, bore a symmetry too precise to be human. Yet the smallest crack near the boy's painted hand exposed something darker beneath the pigment, a streak of red that no varnish could explain. A telegram still lay open on the desk. It had arrived that morning from a provincial chateau near Reims. Murder connected to portrait stop, urgent stop, send Moreau immediately. He had seen messages like this before, riddles written in panic, but this one smelled faintly of linseed oil and damp roses, as though the paper itself had absorbed the air of the crime. Before we follow him into the fog, take a quiet breath. If you live for stories that travel through smoke and memory, where reason falters and atmosphere speaks louder than words, then join this world. Leave a like, share it with another sleepless listener, and subscribe so you never miss the next case from the shadowed files of Inspector Moreau. The lantern is lit. Now let us begin. The rain had not stopped since dawn, though dawn itself seemed reluctant to appear. Paris floated in a vapour of light, the Seine crawling like molten pewter under the bridges, and a faint odour of wet stone rose from the embankments. Inspector Moreau stood before the window of his small apartment above the Quai des Orfèvres, pipe smoke drifting from his hand and mixing with the mist that pressed against the glass. The morning telegram lay open on the table beside him, the words already memorized, though he read them again as one reads a curse, searching for a change that would never come. Murder connected to portrait stop, urgent stop, send Moreau immediately. The message bore the seal of the prefecture and the signature of a magistrate in Reims whom he had never met. He turned it over, noting the faint oil stain at one corner, as if the hand that wrote it had been trembling beside a lamp. He had seen such summons before, but this one carried a peculiar stillness, as though the silence between its words mattered more than the words themselves. A portrait, a murder, and the insistence on his presence. None of it unusual, yet something in the phrasing unsettled him. He thought of other letters once written in haste, the blackmail note that smelled of violets, the unsigned confession left in the pew of Saint-Sulpice, cases that had ended not with arrests, but with echoes. By 8 o'clock, he was on the platform of Gare d'Eu, L'Est, his coat damp and his hat glistening like lacquered slate. The train to Reims wheezed in the fog, exhaling the warmth of coal and iron. Porters moved with the weary grace of men born in perpetual drizzle. Moreau entered a second-class compartment and settled by the window. The carriage smelled faintly of old leather and cheap cologne. Across from him sat a nun with tired eyes and a parcel tied with string. She smiled politely, and he nodded in return. For a time they watched the city recede, chimneys, smokestacks, rooftops dissolving into grey watercolour. As the train clattered eastward, Moreau unfolded his notebook and began to write, not an account, but an impression. He described the telegram's tone, the blot of oil, the nervous scrawl of the sender. Habit more than method. He had long believed that intuition begins with observation, and that what one notices first often hides what one fears to know. Somewhere beyond the glass, fields unrolled like pale linen under rain. The landscape carried a hush, peculiar to winter mornings where every sound feels wrapped in cloth. Occasionally, the inspector's reflection appeared in the window, a lean face with heavy-lidded eyes, the faintest tremor of fatigue around the mouth. He had not slept well since the affair at Montreuil, and though no one spoke of it now, its shadow still trailed behind him like smoke that refuses to disperse. At the first stop, a conductor passed down the corridor announcing delays on account of the weather. Moreau lit another pipe and watched the smoke coil against the ceiling. Somewhere in that rhythm of wheels and wind, his mind began to drift toward the portrait itself. He imagined the painter, anonymous for now, leaning close to the canvas, mixing flesh tones with a dab of crimson, tracing the delicate curvature of a child's smile. How strange that a brushstroke, once laid in silence, could summon tragedy decades later. He wondered if the face in that portrait still resembled anyone living. He wondered if art could remember the sins of its creation. Near Moe, the nun rose and whispered a prayer before disembarking. The carriage filled briefly with the scent of lavender soap. Moreau remained alone until Rams. The station there was nearly deserted. A single porter awaited him with an umbrella and the provincial stiffness of one unused to inspectors from Paris. "Monsieur Moreau?" the man asked. "The carriage is ready." He led him through puddled cobblestones to a black motor car that looked older than its driver. The journey from the station to the Valcourt estate took nearly an hour, winding through bare vineyards and villages, half swallowed by mist. Every so often, the driver crossed himself when the lightning flared beyond the hills. They arrived at last before iron gates entwined with ivy. A long gravel road stretched toward the mansion, a shape of grey stone and shuttered windows perched high above the valley. Even from that distance, the house exuded a stillness that felt deliberate, as though it had practiced silence for generations. The butler, a thin man with frost at his temples, met him at the door. His greeting was precise but tremulous. "Madame Valcourt is expecting you, Inspector. The family is unsettled." Inside, the air smelled of wax and damp fabric. Portraits lined the corridor, their eyes following him as he passed. Ancestors, rendered in fading sepia, the varnish cracked like old skin. In the salon, a fire struggled in the hearth, its flames blue and uncertain. The widow sat nearby in mourning black, her face pale against the dark. She rose when he entered, but did not extend her hand. "Inspector?" she said softly. "I thank you for coming so soon." Her voice carried that quivering dignity of the bereaved who have spoken too many condolences aloud. Moreau inclined his head, letting the silence settle before asking the first question. "You mentioned in your telegram that the murder concerns a portrait. May I see it?" She hesitated. Her eyes flicked toward the far wall where a large canvas hung beneath a sheet of muslin. The butler moved as if to uncover it, but she raised her hand. "Not yet. It has been strange since the night of the death." Her fingers trembled on the chair's carved arm. "I would rather tell you first." So he listened. The victim was her husband's brother, Henri Valcourt, found dead 3 nights ago in the same salon. No forced entry, no theft. His heart had failed, they said, but the expression on his face was so twisted that even the doctor refused to sign without hesitation. And always that portrait, the one Henri had ordered, restored the previous month after decades in storage. It depicted their father, mother, and the young Henri himself at age 10. The artist's name, she recalled, was something Italian, now forgotten. After the restoration, servants began whispering that the boy's eyes had grown brighter, his smile sharper. Foolish superstition, she insisted, yet she could not sleep in the same room afterward. "Who performed the restoration?" Moreau asked. She gestured toward the butler. "A man from Paris, Lefebvre, I believe. He left the morning after the work was finished. We have not heard from him since." Moreau noted the name quietly. "And the night your brother-in-law died?" The widow drew a breath. There was thunder. The house shook. Henri was alone here, admiring the painting. When I found him, he was seated before it, eyes wide open, mouth slightly smiling. And his hand, it was lifted, as if reaching toward the painted boy. A clock chimed somewhere in the corridor, dull and hollow. Moreau's gaze drifted toward the muslin-covered shape. He felt the faintest chill move along his spine, the rational unease that comes when one meets the aftermath of an event too strange for explanation, yet too human for myth. "Madame," he said at last, "I will need to see the portrait." She nodded reluctantly, and the butler approached. As the cloth fell, dust rose like incense. Beneath it, the faces emerged, father, mother, child, rendered with such precision that even in the dim light they seemed to breathe. The boy's eyes were the colour of lake water before a storm. And though Moreau knew it could not be true, he could have sworn the child was looking directly at him. Outside, thunder rolled again, low and continuous, as if the sky itself were trying to remember something buried deep beneath its own clouds. Moreau drew closer to the canvas and, without touching it, studied the fine cracks of varnish, the faint scent of linseed oil, the small irregular patch where the pigment had darkened near the child's hand. There, barely visible, was a single streak of red. Too bright, too recent. He turned toward the widow. "You are certain no one has touched it since?" She shook her head. "No one, Inspector. We have kept the doors locked. Even I have not entered until now." He nodded slowly, pipe forgotten in his pocket. In that silence, the fire gave a sudden hiss as rain struck the chimney, and for an instant, the boy's painted eyes seemed to flicker. The night settled over the Château de Valcourt like a heavy quilt, muffling every sound except the drip of rain from the gutters and the occasional sigh of the wind pressing against the shutters. Inspector Moreau remained in the salon long after the widow had retired upstairs. The portrait loomed above the mantel, its gilded frame catching stray reflections from the fire. It seemed to pulse faintly in the dimness, as though it inhaled the light itself. Moreau sat before it, elbows on knees, pipe cold between his fingers, watching the painted boy's face until the lines began to blur into motion. Fatigue, he told himself, yet his pulse had taken on the rhythm of the storm outside. He rose and crossed the room to the window. Beyond the glass, the valley slept under fog. The vineyards below looked like drowned skeletons. Somewhere a dog barked once and was answered only by silence. From the hallway came the creak of a step, slow, deliberate. He turned, but the corridor was empty. The air inside the house was too still. It carried that faint, sweet odor of decay, found only in rooms sealed too long. He had spent his life among such silences, rooms that held on to the last moments of the dead, unwilling to let go. A clock struck midnight. Moreau left the salon, his boots whispering over the carpet. He explored the ground floor by lamplight, the dining room with its long table and untouched silver, the library where books had swollen with humidity, the narrow conservatory that smelled faintly of earth and neglect. Servants had retreated to their quarters, but their absence felt rehearsed. People in such houses often believed that tragedy could be ignored if left unspoken. He paused at the foot of the main staircase. The walls were lined with portraits, generations of Valcourt fading into amber varnish. In each, the eyes followed him with identical composure. He found himself wondering whether vanity or guilt had compelled families to immortalize themselves this way. Perhaps both. Near the landing hung a smaller canvas, a woman in a white dress holding a rose. Her expression was serene, but the rose was painted black. He made a note of it in his pocketbook before continuing upward. The widow's chamber door stood slightly ajar, a strip of light visible from within. He knocked once and waited. Her voice, faint but composed, called for him to enter. She sat by the dressing table, her hair unbound, a candle flickering beside her reflection in the mirror. On the table lay several letters, sealed but unposted. "You are still awake, Inspector?" she said. "Do you ever sleep?" He smiled faintly. "When Paris sleeps, madame. And she rarely does." Her eyes drifted toward the window. "This house never sleeps either. It listens." She gestured toward the candle flame, trembling in the draught. "You see? Even the air moves as if someone is breathing nearby." He did not answer. Instead, he asked quietly, "Did your husband ever speak of his brother's fears before his death?" She hesitated. Henri was not a fearful man, but he was obsessed. The portrait was his life's relic. He believed it hid a secret left by their father, a clue, perhaps, to some lost inheritance. He spent hours studying it with a magnifying lens. Sometimes I would find him whispering to it. A soft shiver crossed her shoulders. That night, he said the boy had spoken back. Moreau watched her reflection in the mirror rather than her face directly. People spoke more truth to their own likeness. "Do you believe that, madame?" She exhaled slowly. "I believe grief does strange things to the living, and obsession even stranger." The candle flame bent sharply as if in agreement. He thanked her and withdrew. As he closed the door, he noticed one of the letters had no address, only the words, "Forgive me," written across its envelope in a man's hand. Downstairs, the butler waited at the edge of the corridor, holding a lantern. His face was pale with unease. "Inspector," he whispered. "The servants are nervous. They claim to hear voices behind the salon wall. Would you—" Moreau nodded. They returned together to the great room. The fire had burned to embers, and the portrait hung silent above its glow. He motioned for the butler to remain by the door and approached the wall where the sound had been heard. He tapped once with the handle of his pipe. A hollow resonance answered him, not plaster, but wood, thin and brittle. "There's space behind here," he murmured. "Perhaps a recess." He sent the butler for a screwdriver and began to probe the panel's edge. After several minutes of cautious work, the wood shifted, revealing a narrow cavity barely large enough for a man to slip through sideways. The lantern's light revealed a short tunnel leading toward the rear of the house. Dust filled the air like smoke. Inside, spiderwebs clung to the beams like lace curtains. A faint metallic smell lingered, not rust, not oil, something sharper, almost medicinal. He advanced carefully, brushing past cobwebs until the tunnel ended in a small chamber no larger than a closet. There stood a chair, a rusted easel, and several rolled canvases tied with cord. On the floor lay a cluster of used brushes, their bristles stiff with ancient pigment. It was a painter's hiding place, long forgotten. He crouched and unrolled one canvas. A half-finished portrait appeared, the same boy but younger, and without the parents beside him. The eyes, though unfinished, were strikingly similar to those in the grand painting upstairs. He felt the pulse in his throat quicken. Another canvas revealed only the outline of a woman's face, the paint smeared as if erased mid-stroke. He rewrapped them carefully and carried them out. The butler's face blanched when he saw the rolled paintings. "We never knew this was here, sir. The room was sealed before my time." "Who lived here then?" Moreau asked. "The master's father," the man replied. "He died when Henri was a child. Some say, well, there were rumors, about his devotion to art, to spirits." Moreau frowned. "Spirits?" The butler looked away. He believed the painter could trap the soul of his family in the portrait. That immortality could be mixed like pigment. The servants used to say the boy on the canvas was not entirely painted from life. They carried the canvases into the dining hall where Moreau could examine them under better light. Rain streaked the tall windows. Thunder murmured like an old man clearing his throat. The paint, though cracked, still gleamed faintly. He ran a gloved fingertip along the edge of the child's face. The pigment was layered thickly, almost sculptural. Whoever had painted it had used something coarse beneath the surface to give the flesh its uncanny depth. Bone dust, perhaps. He had seen it once before, in a case involving forged icons. He remembered the forensic report's phrasing, organic substrate of unidentified origin. The house moaned under the wind. Somewhere a door slammed. The butler jumped. Moreau simply raised an eyebrow. "Old houses remember their grief," he said quietly. "They protest when disturbed." He re-rolled the canvases and instructed the man to lock them in the study until morning. Then he returned to the salon, where the main portrait waited like a sentinel. For several minutes he simply stood, listening to the slow tick of the mantel clock. The painted boy's gaze met his again, calm, unblinking, almost curious. He thought of the tunnel, the secret room, the unfinished faces. A family's devotion preserved not in bloodline, but in pigment. When he finally left the room, the last ember died behind him, and the darkness closed like a curtain. In the hallway, he paused, sensing the faintest vibration in the floorboards, as if footsteps were descending the stairs ahead, though no one was there. He followed the sound to the base of the staircase and found nothing but the lingering smell of turpentine. He looked once more toward the salon door, now shut. For the briefest instant, he could have sworn he saw light flicker beneath it. Not firelight, but something colder, steadier, the kind of glow that belongs to moonlit water or to the varnish of wet paint. He returned to his room, removed his coat, and sat on the edge of the bed. The storm had passed, yet the house seemed to breathe around him, restless and aware. He wrote a few lines in his notebook before turning down the lamp. The portrait watches. The wall hides more than memory. The widow fears what she believes, but belief is only a door left ajar. Then he closed the book, placed it on the nightstand, and listened as the rain began again, soft, patient, endless. By morning the rain had flattened the vineyards into black calligraphy against the pallor of the fields. The chateau woke late, as if reluctant to face its own silence. Inspector Moreau rose before the servants, shaved with cold water that smelled faintly of iron, and went down to the salon. Night often rearranges a room. He wanted to see what the dark had done. The portrait met him with the same unblinking poise, but the light, jaundiced by the low sky, gave each face a translucence like candle wax. He stood a long time without moving, measuring the room with his breath, listening for the stray click or whisper that reveals a house's private habits. The mantel clock ticked steadily. Somewhere a pipe dripped behind the wall. Beyond the shutters a cart rattled along the distant road. And then, within the hush, a small sound he had not heard before, a measured tapping, irregular, as if someone were testing the boards beneath the floor with a knuckle. He knelt and pressed his ear to the carpet. The tapping ceased. He rose, crossed to the window, and opened the shutter an inch. The air that entered carried the sour perfume of wet vines and the faint smoke of early kitchen fires from the valley. The tapping began again, this time behind the far wall. 3 knocks, a pause, 2 more, the childish pattern of a secret code learned long ago. He answered it with the stem of his pipe. Silence returned with a swiftness that felt deliberate, almost mocking. He closed the shutter and waited. The portrait kept its counsel. By the time the household had assembled, the inspector had traced the wall's perimeter twice, pausing at each seam, noting how the floorboards near the hidden recess flexed more than those under the rug. The butler arrived with coffee and the stiff carriage of a man who pretends not to notice his hands trembling. "You heard it as well, sir?" he asked. "We hear it mostly at night. Last winter, the scullery girl refused to come to the salon after sundown. She said there was a boy behind the wall and he was bored." The man flushed at his own words and added quickly, "Nonsense, of course." "Nonsense has its uses," Moreau said. He drank the coffee, black and harsh, and asked for the housemaids to be sent to the kitchen. He preferred kitchens to drawing rooms for questions. Kitchens are honest. They smell of work and heat. They do not know how to pose. The chateau's kitchen lay at the end of a brick corridor where the walls exhaled cool damp and flower dust floated like pale pollen. A fire had been coaxed to life in the great iron range. Its warmth gathered the servants as surely as a bell. They stood when he entered, a knot of faces trained by habit to emptiness. He asked them to sit. The housekeeper, Madame Tellier, sturdy as a wardrobe and twice as silent, poured coffee into thick cups and distributed them with the authority of a quartermaster. The scullery girl hovered in the doorway, twisting her apron into a rope. The footman, Armand, broad-shouldered, with a scar that ran from ear to jaw like a hurried stitch, stared at the table as if reading a message written there. Moreau lit his pipe with a sliver of kindling and let the smoke rise in a thin ribbon before he spoke. "You have heard things at night," he said, not as a question, but as a door opened for whoever wished to cross. No one moved. Then the kitchen maid he had noticed the previous evening, small, thin, eyes sharp as a bird, lifted her chin. "I am Léonie, monsieur," she said. "It is not only at night. Sometimes at dawn, when the first wind comes down from the hill, there is a knocking in the salon. It sounds like a spoon against a pot, only distant, like from a pantry that has no door." "What else?" Moreau asked. She hesitated, rubbing her thumb along the rim of her cup, collecting courage the way some collect sugar. "I have seen the boy," she said at last. The others stiffened. Madame Tellier muttered a warning that sounded like a prayer. Léonie continued, quieter now. "Not moving as a boy moves, not quite. More like a change in the paint when the firelight breathes. His hand, it was at his side, and then it was near his chest. Only a little. You would think you imagined it. But I know what I see, monsieur. I have eyes." She did not look away, and in the set of her mouth he recognized that stubbornness particular to the poor, who have only their senses to defend themselves with. The footman shifted, the chair creaking beneath him. "You did not see that," he said. "You saw the shadow of the flame. It plays tricks. Madame does not like such talk." His voice carried the clumsy weight of duty. Moreau studied him. "And you? What do you hear, Armand?" The man's jaw tightened over the scar. "Rats, monsieur, in the walls. This is a house, not a chapel." "And yet chapels have rats too," Moreau said, and a few of the servants allowed themselves a brief, nervous smile. He turned to Madame Tellier. "The Restoration? Where did the man work?" She indicated the corridor with a tilt of her head. "In the salon, monsieur. He set up his table near the south window. He stayed 3 days. He drank very little, spoke less, and asked for the door to be locked when he was alone. When he left, he said the varnish should cure in a week. That night, the master heard the first knocks." She crossed herself in a quick, embarrassed gesture. "The inspector asked to see the restoration table. The housekeeper led him to a small storeroom where the smell of old apples and paraffin clung to the shelves. On the table lay a bottle half full of a viscous amber liquid, brushes hardened like claws, a roll of muslin stained in rust-colored streaks, and a rag of chamois that had been cut and recut until it was the size of a handkerchief. Moreau uncorked the bottle and inhaled. Linseed oil and a solvent that bit the nose, heavy, resinous, with a ghost of camphor. He dampened a corner of the chamois and rubbed it across a scrap of gilded moulding lying nearby. The cloth came away tinted pink. He held it to the light. "This rag has been used on something more than varnish," he said evenly. The housekeeper looked away. "We burned the others," she admitted. Madame said the colour made her unwell. He sent for the butler and asked to see the household accounts. The book arrived in a minute, miserly ink columns listing purchases of bread, coal, lamp oil, wine, and 3 weeks prior a line that pricked his attention. Payment to A. Lefebvre, Paris, followed by a separate entry for transport of crate, artists' supplies. The sum for the crate exceeded the fee for the man. He placed his finger on the numbers and felt, beneath the ink, the soft fur of a thought beginning to run. What had come in that crate besides brushes and varnish? What perhaps had been taken away? He spent the late morning retracing the corridor to the hidden recess, measuring each plank with the toe of his boot, listening. At noon the fog thinned, and the house, like a patient whose fever breaks, exhaled a long breath. The tapping did not return, yet a mood remained, as palpable as humidity, and he could not shake the sense that somewhere within the walls a clock with no dial and no hands was counting a private time. After a plain lunch, bread gone soft with damp, cheese sweating under its rind, and a glass of the estate's thin wine, he walked the perimeter of the house with the butler. They paused at each shutter. In the soft light, their reflections looked like intruders. At the rear, below the salon windows, he noticed a discoloration on the sill, a faint reddish smear that the rain had tried but failed to erase. He touched it with his nail. It flaked, leaving a speck under the crescent of keratin. Paint? Blood? Or the overlap where both had made a compromise? He cleaned his nail on his handkerchief and told the butler to have no one wash the stone. Before dusk he returned to the kitchen. He found Leonie by the range, feeding sticks into the fire with a care that suggested she preferred work to thought. He asked her to walk with him to the chapel at the edge of the grounds. They went without speaking, the wet gravel yielding under their steps with the sleepy sound of crushed sugar. The chapel was locked. He peered through the diamond panes. The altar cloth had been folded with fierce precision. A vase of brittle flowers leaned toward a candlestick. "Who tends this?" he asked. Leonie shrugged. "No one, really. We do what we can." He nodded and turned. On the way back, she told him, in the shy rush of someone who has waited to be asked, that the master's father used to disappear at night, carrying a lantern, and that the boy Henri followed him once and stumbled into a room he should not have seen. She had this from her grandmother, who was scullery girl here when she herself was a child. "Maybe it is only a story," she said. "Old houses keep stories as cats keep mice." He thanked her, and in the gesture he meant that he believed enough to continue. Twilight came early, rinsed in pewter. The widow sent word that she was indisposed and would not dine. The servants ate in the kitchen, the footman silent as a post among them. Moreau sat alone in the library, notes spread on the desk, pipe unlit. He had the feeling of a man holding a tune he cannot yet hum. Around 9, wind rose from the east and found the cracks in the shutters. The house answered with its repertoire of protests, a groan in the beams, a rattle along a window latch, the breathy gasp of an old door settling into its frame. And within that orchestration of wood and weather, the knocking returned, faint, eager, the secret language of a child playing at confinement. He walked to the salon without hurry, as one approaches a sleeping animal. The portrait gathered the room's thin light and held it like a swallow in the throat. He stood below it and felt the floor's subtle give. The knocking shifted, not behind the wall now, but under his feet, travelling from the hearth to the centre of the carpet. He stepped aside. The sound followed. The ludicrous thought came to him that it wished to be under him, as if measuring his weight against the weight of another memory. He knelt and lifted a corner of the rug. The boards beneath were scarred from old furniture, stained along one seam by a fluid that had spread in the shape of a small continent. He placed his palm on the stain. It felt no cooler than the wood. He lowered the rug. "What is it you want?" he asked the room, and his voice sounded embarrassed to his own ears. The knocking stopped, as if satisfied by the question, and did not return. In houses where fear has been allowed to sit too long, the night elongates beyond its proper measure. He slept badly. Dreams came in fragments. The boy raising his hand from the paint, a crate rocking slowly on a train platform, a face in a mirror smearing as if someone had breathed across the silver. He woke before dawn to the sound of hurried steps in the corridor, servants' feet, not bothering to disguise their alarm. He dressed and opened his door. Madame Tellier was there, hair unpinned, lantern swinging. "Inspector," she said, breathless, "Armand is gone." They found the footman's room orderly, as if composing its own alibi. The bed was made, the small wardrobe half open, a single shirt on its hook, swaying faintly though no draught touched it. On the table lay Armand's knife, polished to a dark shine, and next to it the key to the side gate that led toward the lake. The butler arrived, white as the china he carried at dinner. "The gate is unlatched," he said. "There are footprints." They went out into the grey seam where night yields to morning. The grass along the path glistened with beads of water like a rosary abandoned in the dew. The footprints were easy to follow, heavy, heel-deep, the stride uneven, as if the walker had carried something in his arms or on his conscience. At the fork near the poplars, the tracks turned toward the reed beds. A heron lifted from the shallows and flew off with the leisurely indignation of old nobility. The lake itself, ringed by winter's colourless grasses, looked like a slate placed carefully on the land by a teacher in a frustrated lesson. The footprints continued on to the narrow timber jetty and then suddenly stopped. At the end of the planks a smear of dark had dried in a small crescent, and a rope, frayed at one end, dangled into the water. Moreau knelt and studied the edge. On a splinter snagged along the final plank, a thread clung, fine, pale, unmistakably linen. He slipped it into his notebook. The butler shivered. "Shall I send for the gendarmes?" he asked. "Yes," Moreau said, rising. "And have your men fetch poles and a boat. We will sweep the reeds." He stood a moment longer, listening to the hush of the water against the posts, the faint rattle of dry seed heads in the rushes, the distant cough of a farm dog. A small object nudged the shore and lodged against a tuft of grass at his feet. He picked it up. A button, brass, worn smooth by years of handling. On its face, almost rubbed away, the crest of the Valcourt family. The day brightened by degrees, but the light did nothing to thin the sense of a hand closing around the house from the outside. Armand's footprints, so emphatic upon departure, gave no sign of return. Léonie stood a little distance off, her apron damp where she had wrung it without noticing. "He would not go into the water," she said, in a voice that tried to be firm and failed. He was proud of fear. He thought it was for others. Moreau looked at the line where footprints stopped and water began. Pride is a poor swimmer, he thought, but he said nothing. He felt. Behind him the chateau's gaze upon his back, and within it the portrait's patient eyes, waiting to see whether the living would draw the same smile across their mouths that the dead now wore in paint. He sent the butler to station a man at every gate and to allow no one into the salon. The first reeds had already begun to whisper as the wind came up from the east. In his coat pocket the brass button tapped faintly against his notebook with each step, a tiny metronome to the new rhythm of the case. Whether Armand had fled or fallen, the portrait had gained another witness or another secret. Moreau could no longer tell which fate the house preferred. The lake lay dull and unmoving beneath the winter light, a flat mirror too weary to reflect. The reeds along its edge trembled whenever the wind passed, and the air carried the faint odour of silt and forgotten leaves. Inspector Moreau stood on the jetty, while two local gendarmes worked the poles through the shallows. The boat creaked, rope coiled like sleeping snakes in its hull. It was the kind of morning when sound itself seemed to stiffen in the cold, every splash and rustle carving a shape into the silence. No body appeared. Only a child's shoe, blackened by mud, drifted out from under the reeds and came to rest near his boots. He lifted it with a handkerchief, too small for a grown man, too old for a recent child. He placed it gently in his coat pocket beside the brass button, two relics of lives that had crossed paths in some unrecorded hour. The butler waited at the shore, his coat collar turned up against the wind. "No trace?" he asked. Moreau shook his head. Not yet. Perhaps never. The lake hides what it loves. The man crossed himself. We've always feared it, sir. In the spring it smells of rot. The old master said the bottom was soft as flour. It swallows anything. Moreau glanced toward the chateau, its grey bulk rising above the slope. Even from here he could sense its windows watching. Fear, he murmured, is the oldest tenet in such houses. By midday the search ended. The gendarmes left their boat moored to the reeds. One of them, a stout man with ruddy cheeks, asked whether the inspector would require an official report. Later, Moreau said, when we know what story the water wants to tell. He turned back up the path. The earth squelched beneath his shoes. The fog returned, folding the landscape in half. At the crest, Leonie waited, her shawl pulled tight around her. Nothing? She asked. He shook his head. Only silence. She looked toward the lake, her lips moving with some private calculation. Then he's still here, she said, and walked away before he could ask what she meant. Inside, the chateau had already resumed its ritual hush. The widow remained upstairs. Madame Terrier busied herself with errands designed to avoid the salon. The servants moved as though carrying invisible glass. In the study, Moreau spread, his notes across the desk. The pages smelled faintly of lake air. He reviewed the sequence again, the portrait, the knocking, the missing footman, the smear of red. It formed a pattern like one of those puzzles he had seen as a boy, a jumble of shapes that only revealed a face when one stepped back far enough. But the face he glimpsed was still incomplete. He needed history, not rumor. He summoned the butler. "How long have you served here?" Moreau asked. 15 years, monsieur, since the death of the old master." "And before you, who kept the keys?" "My father, for a time. He died in the servants' wing, fell from the stairs." The inspector's eyebrow lifted slightly. "At night?" "During a storm, they say. He was carrying a lantern. The flame went out when he hit the floor. And the portrait then, where was it?" "Stored in the attic, sir. The widow's father wanted it hidden. He said it unsettled his dreams." Moreau nodded. "Dreams or memories?" The man hesitated. "Perhaps both." When the butler had gone, Moreau took his lamp and climbed the narrow staircase leading to the attic. The air grew colder with each step, the wood smelling of old dust and mouse droppings. At the top, he found a row of crates marked with fading ink. Household linens, ledgers, music. One, however, bore no label. Its lid had been nailed shut, but the nails were new, the metal still bright. He pried it open with the handle of his knife. Inside lay stacks of letters tied with pink ribbon and wrapped in tissue. The handwriting was elegant, foreign. A. Fontana, Montmartre. The painter, he thought. Beneath the letters, rolled in paper, were 3 glass plates from an early camera. He held them to the lamplight. Negative images appeared, a man before an easel, a child seated on a stool, a woman with her hand on the boy's shoulder. The man's face was sharp, the boy's a blur. Movement caught during the exposure, as if the child had tried to leave. He packed the plates carefully and returned to the study. On the way down, he caught sight of Leonie dusting the banister. "Do you know this name?" he asked, showing her one letter. "Fontana?" She frowned. "No, monsieur. Only that people said the painter spoke Italian when drunk and Latin when sober." He smiled at that. "And when dead?" She shivered. "Then he speaks through paint." By evening, rain returned, heavier, insistent. The portrait shimmered each time lightning flared through the windows. The widow descended for supper, her face pale but composed. She refused food, took only wine. "The footman?" she asked. "Was he?" "Gone," Moreau replied. "Perhaps drowned, perhaps not. Until we find a body, he is neither." She looked away. "He hated the painting," she whispered. "Said it stared through him. Once he threatened to burn it. I should have sent him away. Moreau studied her profile, the tension at her temple. When did he say this? 2 nights ago. He was drinking, said he would throw it into the fire and free the house of its ghost. Her hands tightened on the glass stem. And then he vanished. The inspector leaned back. You believe the portrait defends itself? She met his eyes. I believe men do terrible things for less reason. She stood and left the room, her shadow crossing the wall like ink spilled on parchment. Later, when the household had gone to bed, Moreau unlocked the study once more. He laid the glass plates under the lamplight and studied them with a magnifying lens. The boy's blurred face in the photograph appeared to stretch toward the painter, mouth open, as if caught mid-breath. In the final plate, the canvas showed a faint reflection, not of the child, but of a man's arm reaching from the opposite side where no mirror stood. He exhaled slowly and turned the image away. Photographic errors, perhaps, or something that light alone could not explain. He walked to the salon. The fire there had dwindled to ash, the smell of turpentine faint but persistent. He drew closer to the portrait, lamp held high. The father's hand on the boy's shoulder gleamed slickly. The varnish there had softened, perhaps from heat. With the tip of his knife, he scraped a flake from the lower edge. Beneath the ochre layer lay another, darker, almost black. He touched it with the cloth from Lefebvre's table. The rag bloomed red. Blood darkens as it dries, but this red was fresh in hue. He held it to the light, a ghost of colour suspended in fabric, then folded it into his notebook. The sound came just as he turned to leave, a slow creak from the attic above, a single board complaining. He waited. Another creak followed, and a faint thud like a drawer being closed. He drew his revolver and climbed the stairwell again. The lamplight quivered in his grip. At the landing, dust motes swirled like golden insects. He moved toward the open crate. The letters lay scattered across the floor now, their ribbons untied, pages fluttering in the draught from a cracked window. No one. Only air and the distant beat of the rain. Yet on the wall above the crate, something new appeared, a smear of wetness the size of a hand, red as sealing wax. He touched it, sticky. The lamp guttered as he turned. From somewhere below came the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. He descended 2 steps at a time. In the salon, the window had burst inward. Rain spattered the carpet. The portrait swayed slightly on its wire. On the floor beneath it lay a small object glinting in the lamplight, a cufflink shaped like a coiled serpent. Moreau picked it up. Not his. Not the butler's. Armand, he murmured. The serpent's eyes were chips of garnet, one missing. The match to the lost button, perhaps, or the token of a debt. He stood there listening to the rain drip from the frame, watching how each droplet carved a darker path down the varnish, like tears, retracing an old habit. For the first time he thought he saw fatigue in the boy's face, not malice, not mystery, but weariness, as though even painted children grow tired of waiting for the living to understand them. When dawn broke, the gendarmes returned. No body, they said again, only ripples where the reeds moved. Moreau dismissed them and sat at the widow's desk until the ink on his report turned to a dull sheen. His final line read, "The lake gave nothing back, but the house has begun to speak." He signed his name with deliberate pressure, sealing the thought into permanence. And yet, as he closed the notebook, the floor beneath his chair creaked once, slow, deliberate, like a man settling into place. He looked toward the portrait, now faint in the morning light, and wondered whether it was the house or the unseen observer that had chosen to answer. When Inspector Moreau returned to Paris, the fog seemed to recognize him. It moved aside to let him pass through the courtyard of the prefecture, curling like breath around his shoes, and carried with it the metallic scent of the river. The city had changed little in his absence. The same hoarse cries of newsboys, the same rattle of wheels over whetstones, the same fatigue of a metropolis that had learned to hide its conscience behind smoke. But to him the light appeared different. It had the tint of varnish, the same amber hue that gleamed across the portrait's surface. Even the puddles on the quay reflected not grey sky, but something deeper, more oil than water. He spent his first night back in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the desk littered with telegrams and reports awaiting his return. Among them was one message, forwarded from Reims, noting the failure to recover the missing footman's body. Another, from the local registry, confirmed the death of the painter A. Fontana 15 years earlier. A suicide, recorded without ceremony, body found in Montmartre. Yet the letters in the Valcourt attic bore dates after that death. Either Fontana had lived longer than recorded, or someone else had written under his name. In Moreau's experience, lies aged faster than truth, but left a stronger odour. By morning he had a plan. He walked from the prefecture to Montmartre, past bakeries opening their shutters, past the grey line of laundresses hanging sheets that steamed like ghosts above the alleys. The hills smelled of wine, stone dust, and cold bread. At the corner of Rue des Abbesses stood a café whose sign, Le Lit Rouge, had faded to the colour of dried blood. The place was nearly empty, occupied by painters who had forgotten their youth and models who had never found theirs again. Moreau ordered black coffee and waited. He knew the name Fontana would travel faster through this quarter than any formal inquiry. It took less than an hour. A man approached his table, hat in hand, cautious, curious. He introduced himself as Jules Caradec, a restorer of religious icons who had once shared a studio wall with the late Fontana. His eyes were a watery blue, rimmed with yellow fatigue, and his fingers bore the faint polish of a lifetime spent sanding frames. "You're from the police," he said, not as accusation, but as diagnosis. Moreau nodded. "I'm looking for the truth about a commission. A family portrait painted at the Château de Valcourt. Fontana's name appears on the letters. Do you remember it?" Caradec's mouth twitched into a bitter smile. "Remember it? I remember the day he began it and the night he ended it. It was the only work he ever refused payment for." He signalled to the waiter for another coffee, though his hands shook too much to lift it when it came. "We were young," he said, "hungry. Fontana was different, quiet, almost devout in his craft. He talked about art as a kind of resurrection. Not creation, you see, but reanimation. He said the canvas is a grave where light refuses to die. I thought it was poetry. Then came the Valcourts. They paid well, and they wanted something more than likeness. They wanted permanence." Moreau leaned forward slightly. "He worked at their estate?" "Yes, for months. He came back to Paris changed. Spoke of the child, Henri, I think, as if he were both subject and accomplice. Said the boy could hold his gaze longer than any adult, as though he saw the world from the other side of the mirror. He started talking about formulas, varnish mixed with bone, pigment tempered with blood. I told him he was mad. He said madness was the shortest road to art." The inspector studied the man's trembling fingers. "Did you ever see him again?" Caradec laughed once, without humour. "Oh, yes. 2 years later he came to me one night, drenched in sweat, eyes wild. He said the painting was unfinished, that the soul he'd captured refused to stay still. He kept hearing whispers from the canvas, the boy asking to be let out. He burned his sketches in my stove that night, all except one." From his coat, Caradec drew a folded sheet of paper. It had yellowed at the edges, the pencil lines faded but legible, the outline of a small hand pressed against a window pane. Beneath it, written in quick strokes, "He is learning to smile." Moreau studied it for a long moment. The drawing was neither childlike nor adult. It belonged to that uncertain border where innocence begins to imitate cruelty without understanding it. "Why keep this?" he asked quietly. Karadec shrugged. "Because I wanted to remember the moment I stopped painting. I could no longer trust what we made with our hands." He hesitated. "You know, Fontana didn't die in Montmartre. They found his clothes by the river, but not his body. Some say he walked into the Seine during one of those fogs when the city forgets itself. Others claim he went back to the chateau." Outside, bells began to toll noon. The cafe light shifted, and for an instant, Moreau imagined the walls themselves exhaling. "Did he ever mention anyone helping him with the restoration?" "A man named Lefebvre, perhaps. A pupil. Young, ambitious. The kind who thinks art is a ladder, not a mirror. I never met him." Moreau nodded, pocketed the sketch, and left a few coins on the table. When he stepped back into the street, the air felt heavier. Even Montmartre, with all its noise and decay, seemed subdued, as though a cloud had entered every room and refused to leave. He spent the afternoon in the archives, tracing the painter's contracts. One file, brittle and dust-stained, contained the record of a second commission by the Valcourt family, dated just before the painter's disappearance, restoration, and duplication of portrait for private use. Duplication, but the word struck him. Two versions of the same painting. Perhaps the one in the chateau was not the first, but the replacement. What then of the original? He requested the file's attachments, but the clerk returned empty-handed. "Missing since 1908, the man said. "A fire, many records lost." Moreau thanked him, though his mind was already elsewhere. The missing canvas, the footman's disappearance, the handprint in the attic. The puzzle rearranged itself into a new, more menacing symmetry. At dusk he returned to his apartment. The lamplighter was just beginning his rounds, each flame blooming against the fog like a thought refusing to die. On his desk a telegram awaited him. It was unsigned. "Return at once. Stop. Second. Death. Stop. Valcourt estate. Stop. Urgent." His stomach tightened. The widow, perhaps, or Léonie. Either way, the house had not finished speaking. He packed a small bag, slipped the sketch into his wallet, and caught the night train back to Reims. The compartment was empty. Rain streaked the window, blurring the landscape into a single ribbon of grey. He thought of Fontana's words. "The canvas is a grave where light refuses to die." What if the painter had indeed returned to the chateau, not in body but in essence? What if Lefebvre, his pupil, had continued the experiment with the same blind faith in immortality? In such minds, art and death are twins. The thought clung to him like damp wool. He tried to shake it off, but each turn of the wheels only made the rhythm more insistent. Somewhere between stations, he dozed. In the half-dream that followed, he saw the portrait again. Only this time the boy stood beside it, alive, watching him with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Behind the child, the surface of the painting rippled as though breathing. He woke with a start as the train slowed into Reims. The platform lights glowed through the mist like floating embers. A messenger waited at the carriage door. "Inspector Moreau?" he asked. "From the Valcourt estate. They said to bring you at once." Moreau followed him into the carriage. The driver said nothing during the journey. The horses moved through the fog with mechanical obedience. When the gates of the chateau emerged, the lamps by the door were unlit. Even the house seemed to be holding its breath. Inside, the butler met him with eyes that no longer pretended composure. "It's Madame, sir," he said. "We found her in the salon." They walked through the corridor where the portraits hung, their painted faces half vanished in shadow. The door to the salon stood open. The fire was burning too brightly, as though it had been fed not with wood, but with something that wished to vanish quickly. The widow sat before the hearth, her posture perfect, her expression oddly serene. Only the colour of her lips betrayed her, a red, too vivid, too deliberate, painted in a careful curve. On the floor beside her chair lay an overturned palette knife, and a small, open jar of pigment. Moreau stepped closer, his heart drumming with that quiet fury of helpless recognition. The portrait above the mantel glowed in the firelight. The boy's mouth, which had always been a line of studied solemnity, now bore a smile, unmistakable, faintly cruel, unmistakably new. The change was subtle yet absolute, like dawn crossing the threshold. He turned toward the butler. "Who was here?" The man shook his head. "No one, monsieur. The doors were locked from the inside." Moreau stood before the painting, the heat of the fire at his back, and felt the distance between life and its imitation collapse into a single breath. The child in the canvas seemed almost to exhale. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled like the turning of a page. He did not move until the fire's crackle softened into silence, and the room smelled once more of varnish and rain. The snow began before dawn, fine as sifted flour, drifting across the vineyards and muffling the paths around the chateau. Inspector Moreau watched it from the window of the small guest room, the pale light tracing his reflection over the glass until he seemed to stand beside himself. In the corridor beyond his door, the house was still, emptied of servants and sound, yet somehow more alive than when it had been full. Every creak of timber felt deliberate, like breath drawn between words. He had not slept. Each time his eyes closed, he saw the widow's painted smile and the boy's matching expression. Two mouths, one real, one rendered, locked in the same impossible curve. Downstairs, the magistrate from Reims had arrived with two clerks and the weary confidence of a man accustomed to sealing tragedies into paper. He offered condolences that meant nothing and requested the inspector's statement. Moreau gave him the facts: the locked room, the overturned palette knife, the open jar of pigment, the smile. He omitted the rest. Some details were better left to the realm of atmosphere. Bureaucracy has no column for what glances back. The magistrate signed a preliminary report of self-inflicted death, though even as the pen left the page, he hesitated. "Strange business," he murmured. "To paint one's own lips before dying." Moreau only nodded. He had seen stranger, though rarely so intimate. When the officials departed, the house resumed its watchfulness. He moved to the widow's study, now sealed with ribbon and wax. On her desk lay the testament that had summoned the magistrate, a document older than her marriage, the will of the late patriarch Valcourt. The ink had browned to the colour of old tea, the handwriting a stern procession of loops and flourishes. Near the end, in a clause that the clerks had read without comprehension, appeared the words that would reorder the case entirely. Ownership of the estate and all contained within shall transfer to the surviving heir, only when the painted heir smiles again. He read it twice. Lawyers are capable of cruelty masked as wit, yet this phrasing felt less like a joke than a spell. The painted heir could only mean the boy in the portrait, Henri as a child. But Henri was dead, and the boy had smiled. Somewhere between law and superstition, inheritance had crossed into ritual. He closed the folder and leaned back. If the father had believed in Fontana's art as a vessel for the family's essence, then the clause was not symbolic, it was literal. The estate could not change hands until the image itself displayed joy, however achieved. The widow, in painting her lips, had perhaps attempted to complete that command, to coax the portrait into compliance, to secure possession for a bloodline already spent. Afternoon bled through the snow clouds, dim and amber. Moreau asked the butler to fetch the house ledgers once more. Among the records he found recent drafts of letters addressed to a notary in Paris, all unsigned, all requesting confirmation of the will's conditions. The handwriting was the widow's, tremulous yet deliberate. She had been preparing for something, perhaps for death, perhaps for the portrait's final metamorphosis. Beneath the letters lay a folded slip, a receipt from an apothecary in Reims for cinnabar pigment and arsenic powder. Both were poisons. Both, mixed with oil, produce a red that glows unnaturally under firelight. He imagined her in the salon that last night, dipping the palette knife into that lethal hue, touching it to her lips, leaving the rest for the boy. He stepped into the corridor. The shutters rattled lightly. The butler followed at a respectful distance, silent as guilt. "Was there ever mention of a second portrait?" Moreau asked. The man hesitated. "Only once, monsieur. The old master had a copy made before the war. He said one should never depend on a single likeness. It hung in his study for years, but after his death it vanished. Madame believed it destroyed." "And where was that study?" "In the West Wing, now unused." The inspector's footsteps echoed as they crossed into the disused corridor. Dust veiled the air, each mote a tiny floating ember in the slanted light. The door to the study stuck halfway before, yielding with a sigh. Inside, the scent of mildew and stale paper clung to everything. Against the far wall, covered by a yellowing sheet, stood a large rectangle. He drew the cloth away. Another portrait, smaller, darker, its pigments dulled by neglect. Yet the faces were the same, father, mother, and child. Only here the boy's mouth was open, not in a smile but in a cry. The paint had cracked around it as if resisting change. Beneath the frame, a signature barely visible, A. Fontana, 1903. So the duplicate existed, hidden and forgotten. Perhaps the painter himself had delivered it secretly, unable to destroy what his commission demanded. Perhaps the father had kept it as insurance. Moreau brushed away the dust. The child's eyes, even under grime, held an energy absent from the brighter version downstairs. They seemed to plead rather than watch. He thought of the widow's body before the fire, the red on her mouth, the forced grin of the boy above her. Between these two canvases lay the arc of the family's sin, a transition from terror to triumph. He ordered the painting carried to the salon. When it was placed opposite the first, the resemblance was grotesque, like two mirrors facing each other across a coffin. The butler crossed himself again. "Which is the original, monsieur?" he asked. "Whichever remembers more," Moreau said. He instructed that neither fire nor light touch the room until he returned. Then he took the carriage into Reims. At the notary's office the air smelled of ink and old leather. The clerk who had handled the Valcourt estate was a thin man with spectacles so thick they distorted his eyes into spheres. He confirmed that the patriarch had been eccentric but precise. "He believed the soul could be measured," the clerk said. "He once asked me if a contract signed by a man whose image outlived him would still hold. I thought he was joking." From the cabinet he retrieved an older folio containing letters between the elder Valcourt and Fontana. The painter wrote of progress, of transferring likeness beyond decay. In the final note, Valcourt replied, "Then I shall rest when my boy learns to smile again." Moreau left the office under a bruised sky. The snow had turned to sleet, each flake striking the umbrella with a sound like whispered punctuation. Back in the carriage, he reread the line until it blurred. The inheritance clause was not a metaphor, it was instruction. The boy's smile was the key to continuity. And now, after the widow's death, the smile had appeared. The estate, by law, would revert to the next of kin, none but the dead Henri's lineage. Yet Henri had left no children, only rumours of a bastard son in the countryside. If such an heir existed, he would soon emerge, summoned by lawyers and greed. When the chateau came into view again, dusk had fallen. Lamps burned in the windows, reflections quivering like eyes half open in sleep. The butler met him at the door, pale, trembling. "Inspector, the servants are leaving. They say the house breathes through the walls. And the two portraits, mon Dieu, they change with the light." Moreau followed him to the salon. The air inside was warmer, almost fevered. The original portrait shone in the lamplight the boy's smile faint but persistent. The duplicate opposite had grown darker still. The paint around the mouth seemed to have softened, sagging into a grimace. Between them, the fire hissed and flared as though feeding on invisible draughts. He stood between the two images, one joyful, one suffering, and felt the room pulse with a rhythm not his own. "Balance," he whispered. "One takes, the other gives." If Fontana's experiment had been to fix emotion in paint, perhaps each alteration demanded compensation. The joy of one face fed on the anguish of its twin. The widow's death, the footman's disappearance, the painter's madness, all tributes to maintain equilibrium. A sound drew his attention, paper crackling. On the mantel, heat curled the edges of the patriarch's will, left carelessly near the flame. He caught it before it burned, but a line had already blackened. The painted air smiles again, the ink blistered into illegibility, as though the condition had fulfilled itself and sought erasure. Outside, the wind rose. The shutters struck the stone like fists. From somewhere deep in the west wing came a single loud crash, wood splitting, glass shattering. The butler flinched. "It's the study," he whispered. They ran through the corridor, lanterns swinging. The duplicate painting lay face down on the floor, its frame cracked, the canvas torn across the boy's mouth. Through the rip showed another layer of paint beneath, a darker portrait, barely visible, of the same child, eyes closed, as if asleep. Moreau touched the exposed edge. It was dry, ancient. The smell that rose from it was not paint, but dust and something else, faintly sweet, unmistakable. Bone. He closed his eyes for a moment. Fontana's formula, the ground pigment, the organic substrate. Here was proof. The portrait contained the child twice, once in likeness, once in matter. The painter had used the boy himself. He covered the tear with a sheet and told the butler to lock the door. Back in the corridor, he felt the weight of the house pressing around him, each board swelling with secrets. The legal mind in him understood that the case would end with signatures, reports, certificates of death. But another mind, the one that lived by instinct, smell, and silence, knew the truth would not stay confined. Somewhere within the varnish of that smiling face, the boy still waited, learning new expressions, fed by those who dared to love the Valcourt name. That night, unable to rest, Moreau wrote in his notebook, "The will fulfilled itself. The law of the living obeyed the grammar of the dead." Then he set down his pen and listened. From the salon below came a sound, soft as laughter, not mocking, not kind, merely patient. Paris received the news like a match dropped into old paper. By noon the next day, hawkers along the Boulevard Saint-Michel cried the headlines with theatrical sorrow, and the cafes learned a new name for their evening conversations, the Valcourt smile. It sounded harmless enough when printed in black ink between advertisements for patent tonics and stage reviews, yet Inspector Moreau felt how a phrase could hollow a life as quickly as rot hollows fruit. He stood before a kiosk where the damp pages flapped in the river wind, reading the variations with growing weariness. One sheet favored tragedy, widow dies beneath smiling child. Another preferred the occult, painter's curse. Claims, second victim. A third, trashy and sure of itself, printed a blurry photograph of the salon window broken by weather and captioned it, "Doorway for the Dead." Only the smallest column in a respectable paper named "The Essentials without decoration," time, place, names, then closed its mouth like a gentleman a beat before gossip begins. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the superintendent called him in with that particular look, reserved for cases the press picks like a wound. The room smelled of damp wool and cigarette ends crushed too hastily. "They want blood," he said, tapping a stack of clippings with 2 fingers. "If not from the painting, then from us. Close it, Moreau. Call it despair and be done." Moreau watched the smoke climb from his pipe, as if it might spell a rebuttal in the air. "And when the missing footman surfaces?" he asked mildly. You'll be asked why we concluded without a body. The superintendent shrugged, tired to the bone. Let the river make its report. The public wants a ghost until it remembers crimes require work. He softened, seeing the inspector's silence. You look older than last week. I have been visiting old things, Moreau said, and left with the folder under his arm. The letters began that afternoon, envelopes thick with indignation or tenderness, or the kind of intimacy people reserve for strangers. Several contained fragments of folklore, paintings that looked back, icons that wept, mirrors that learned their owner's habits and then refused to forget them. One, written in an educated hand on expensive stationery, offered a theory about optical memory and the way pigments, once warmed by grief, might hold it like a scent. Another, anonymous, accused him of conspiring to hide the family's heresies, adding a sketch of a small coffin and the words "Free the boy" in childish capitals. The typist from downstairs brought them in tied with string, eyes bright with the pleasure of proximity to a story. He thanked her and slit them open one by one, as if the envelopes themselves might contain a cure. Instead, they offered what rumour always offers: heat without light. Toward evening, Léonie arrived in Paris under the protection of the butler, who had developed a paternal stiffness, as if responsibility might shield him from grief. She sat in the inspector's office with her hands folded on her lap, gaze fixed on the window as if she could see the Seine through the grimy glass. "They are taking the portrait to Reims tomorrow," she said. "The magistrate asked for custody while the will is determined." Her mouth twisted at the last word, as if the dead had to sign for their own departures. Moreau studied her. The city had already touched her face, its fatigue, its resolve. "You are safe here," he said. She shook her head. "I am not afraid, only tired of listening." He nodded. "Rumour speaks louder in a quiet house." "It speaks in any house with doors," she answered. And for a moment he saw the woman she would become when the kitchen years were behind her. On his way home, he bought the evening paper and carried it folded under his arm like a small, wet dog. The drizzle had returned, softening faces, softening voices, making the gaslights into moons seen through tears. In his apartment, he read the lead article 3 times, a profile of the Valcourt family, written with the confident cruelty of a reporter who has never been asked to sit through the night beside a body. It traced the patriarch's industry, the estates, the charitable gestures, then arrived at the portrait as if at a punchline. One paragraph, in that fatal tone of sensible men who do not admit what they fear, suggested the widow's death had been the logical end of a feminine temperament exposed to superstition. He folded the page without tearing it. He had spent his life observing how logic, once dressed in contempt, could excuse anything. A telegram from Reims arrived close to midnight. The gendarmes had found nothing in the lake but weeds and the remnants of a net. A fisherman, old and talkative, remembered seeing a man by the jetty 2 nights before. Standing so still he shamed the reeds. The description, when coaxed from the ruin of memory, fit no one precisely, and everyone in outline. The fisherman remembered the glint of a pin at the man's wrist. Moreau took the cufflink from his drawer and set it beside the message. A coiled serpent grinned up at him with its broken garnet eye. If Armand had not joined the mud, he had joined the city. Men like him always did, vanishing into Paris the way a hand vanishes into a pocket. By morning, there were handbills pasted around the bridges showing a sketch of the portrait's boy, exaggerated into impish mischief by a cartoonist quick with lines and slow with sorrow. Children collected the images for a game they did not understand. A violinist near Pont-Neuf worked the rumour into his patter, playing a lilting tune he announced as "Laughter" in varnish. People tossed him coins for the comfort of a title that named their unease. Moreau watched from the parapet, the river below, swollen and sullen. He emptied his pipe into the water and saw the ash float 2 seconds before dissolving, an ending so frank it felt indecent. At noon, he met a man from a respectable weekly who asked for an interview. Off the record, the journalist said, in that sly way that turns professional obligation into a whispered confession. Is the portrait altered? The inspector considered the phrasing. Paintings alter, he said at last. So do we. The journalist smiled, disappointed in a gentlemanly way, and mentioned a rumour gathering like thunder in the countryside, Henri Valcourt's bastard son. He has a name? Moreau asked. Several, the man replied lightly. But gossip only needs a shape. When he had gone, the office felt colder. He wrote one sentence in his notebook and underlined it. Greed always finds a mouth to wear. By late afternoon, a letter arrived with the prefecture seal requesting his presence at a private meeting. The superintendent waited with a member of the ministry who wore a flower in his buttonhole and a face trained never to register disgust. We are inundated, the official said simply. We wish to avoid the impression that the police chase phantoms while the living go unguarded. Kindly transfer the matter to the civil courts and return to your other work. Moreau looked at his hands, broad, ink-stained, older than he remembered them. The living go unguarded precisely when we close doors too quickly, he said. The official arranged his flower and smiled without warmth. Then leave one door ajar, but let it be a magistrate's. He did not argue. He left the building, as the lamps along the quay lit one after another, a procession like the slow unravelling of a rosary. Even in the city's rhythm he could hear the chateau breathing at the edge of his thoughts. Before turning home, he stopped at a shop that sold artists' materials and asked the proprietor 3 questions about varnish, heat, and the resurrection of dulled colours. The man answered, as tradesmen do when asked for knowledge rather than barter, clearly, without haste, pleased to be useful. There is a phenomenon, he said, drawing a circle on the counter with a damp cloth. Old resin softens when warmed and then hardens again, trapping whatever touched it in the interval. A fingerprint, for instance, or breath. Moreau thanked him, left a coin he did not need to leave, and stepped into the damp evening with his lungs suddenly tight. Breath. He imagined the widow leaning close to the canvas, speaking to the boy, the fire behind her waking the varnish until it could hold a final intimacy. He slept a little before dawn. In that shallow valley of rest, where dreams resemble memoranda, he saw Fontana's sketch of the small hand, then the hand itself pressed to the inside of glass, then the glass dissolved into water that tasted faintly of metal. He woke with the taste on his tongue. A note had been slid under his door while he slept, folded with the secrecy of bad news, shared between children. He returns tonight. The one with the serpent. No signature. He dressed quickly and went out into the colourless morning, where the city looked as if drawn in pencil and not yet inked. He walked the length of the river until dusk, then the streets around Les Halles, then the cheaper cafés of Montmartre, then the narrow alleys near the Butte Chaumont, where men carried their solitude the way others carry a violin case. At midnight he found what he had been taught to expect, the patient face of a man pretending he did not recognize an inspector. Armand sat alone at a zinc counter, coat unbuttoned, cuff bare where the twin to the serpent should have been. He looked older by an hour, a day, a death. Moreau took the stool beside him. Neither spoke for a time. The counter smelled of spilled wine and the clean fatigue of soap. It followed me, Armand said finally, in the careful voice of a man balancing his words as if they might spill. Not the boy, the house. The house wears you if you touch it too long. Moreau nodded, accepting the superstition as one accepts a coat offered in rain. Why run? He asked. Armand rotated the empty glass by its rim. I didn't run, I left. There is a difference. Running implies you think you can be caught. He glanced at the inspector's hand near the glass, at the patient shape of the pipe in the other. I took nothing from the house. I meant to burn it, the portrait, 2 nights before. I brought the lamp close, and the varnish woke like skin. It breathed on me. His mouth twitched. I have been around fires all my life, and I never smelled anything so alive. "Where is the serpent's twin?" Moreau asked. Armand looked at his wrist, as if surprised to find it bare. "Lost at the lake," he said. "I went to the water to see if it would return anything. It returned a man who looked like me and felt like someone else." He walked away. His eyes went distant, tired of their own use. "There is a will," he added, almost as an afterthought. "A sentence about a smile. You have seen it. Others have too. I will not be the man who brings an heir to a house that eats breath." They left together, not as captor and quarry, but as two men sharing a night, because the night was too large for one. Outside, the fog had thickened to the texture of silk. Footsteps softened, the city lost its edges. As they reached the corner, Armand stopped, listening. From somewhere beyond the fog came the thin cry of a newsboy pushing the final edition. "Smile moves to Reims. Investigation closed." The cry repeated, a litany without a priest. Armand exhaled. "There," he said. "You have your report." He turned as if to vanish back into Paris, and in that half-turn Moreau saw the serpent's ghost glint at his wrist, the place where wealth had promised itself and found only skin. He did not call him back. Some men choose their disappearances with more care than their lives, and to arrest them is to commit a smaller cruelty to prevent a larger one later. Instead, he returned to his apartment and lit his lamp. On the table he arranged the clippings, the sketch of the small hand, the thread of linen from the jetty, the brass button, the receipt for cinnabar, the note about breath. The city outside hummed like a hive, slowly forgetting winter. He wrote for an hour, then stopped and sat listening to his own breathing until he could no longer tell whether it belonged to him or to the house far away. Near dawn, as the sky behind the domes paled into a tired yellow, a final telegram arrived from Reims. "Portrait sealed. Stop under guard. Stop magistrate requests your presence at dawn. Tomorrow. Stop anomalies observed in varnish, surface under cold light. Stop. Please advise." He read it twice, not because the words were unclear, but because clarity sometimes needs to be handled. Anomalies under cold light. He imagined the boy's face stilled by something harsher than fire, a light that refused warmth and therefore refused forgiving. The case that rumor had claimed for itself was asking, one last time, for a policeman's answer. He folded the telegram and set it beside the lamp. In the growing silence, he heard a single cart rattle across the quay, then the whistle of a distant train, then nothing but the soft tick of his wall clock, marking time no one had paid for. He felt suddenly fiercely awake. Tomorrow at dawn he would stand before the portrait without the city's chatter in his ears, without a widow's grief, without a servant's fear. Only paint and a man who knew how to listen. He extinguished the flame and let the room go dark, the way a stage goes dark before the final act begins. The road back to Reims cut through an early dawn that had no color, only gradients of frost. Inspector Moreau sat alone in the rear compartment of the courier motor car, the telegram folded precisely in his gloved hand. The engine rattled like an old man's chest. The horizon kept its secrets in grayscale. Once more, the vineyards appeared, sleeping beneath their thin quilt of snow, and in the quiet between the motor's chokes he heard the phantom echo of a boy's laughter. Not real, not imagined, merely remembered from a place beyond language. At the estate, gendarmes stood at either side of the great door, rifles tucked inward, as if the danger were already inside. Their eyes flickered with that particular discomfort men feel when tasked with guarding something they do not believe in but fear all the same. Moreau stepped past them without a word. Inside, the air was still but not lifeless, more like a held breath, waiting for the room to decide whether to exhale or scream. The magistrate awaited him in the salon, his face pinched in the way of a man trying to reconcile duty with disbelief. "Thank you for coming, Inspector," he began, pointing to the portrait. "We've secured it, as requested, but there is something else." Moreau's eyes followed the man's gesture. The canvas remained on the mantel, flanked now by 2 iron sconces, lit with low, cold lamps. Alchemist's light. Beneath it, a thin dusting of frost had formed along the gilded frame, as though winter itself had slithered indoors to rest on the boy's smile. "Last night," the magistrate said, lowering his voice, "the guards reported a sound, not the wind, a tapping, slow, deliberate." He cleared his throat, and in the cold lamp's reflection they thought they saw movement in the paint. "The varnish seems to shift. Please see for yourself." Moreau approached the portrait and leaned in, careful not to let his breath condense over the surface. The painted boy stared out, eyes clearer now in this antiseptic glow, more certain of their shape, more resolute in their depth. The smile remained, faint but sharp, as if each side of the mouth had been tensioned with thread. With a gloved hand, Moreau raised a small hand lens and studied the boy's eye. The iris, the brushstrokes, the lash line. What he saw was not movement, but something more unsettling, a faint ripple at the edge between pigment and varnish, like skin layered over scar tissue. It had thickened, not uniformly, only over the child's face, the locus of expression. He checked again near the edges, near the frame, near the spot where he had once scraped the pigment. The varnish was no longer simply layered. It had grown, cell-like, into something nearer flesh than gloss, amorphous but undeniably organic. "Varnish does not do this," Moreau said quietly. "We sent for a chemist," the magistrate replied. "He examined a flake under glass, said it contained traces of calcium and hemoglobin." The word lingered like something rotten in the air. He suggested it may have incorporated external elements after the restoration. From where, he could not say. The inspector nodded. He could say, but the truth had little interest in laboratory fortitude. The duplicate painting, rescued from the study, lay sprawled on a side table, its tear hastily mended, its canvas still darkened with age. The 2 boys faced one another now across the salon, one younger, screaming, captured in a perpetual gasp, the other, older, smiling, lips sealed with a peace that no child had ever worn honestly. The magistrate followed Moreau's gaze. "2 versions," he muttered. "Which is true?" "All of them," the inspector said. "And none?" He asked for the room to be cleared. When the last guard had gone, when only the house and its ghostly child kept him company, Moreau sat before the smiling portrait and addressed it the way one might address a witness who has finally stopped lying. "You've done what was asked of you," he murmured. "You smiled. The house relaxes now, the will completes its circle, but you are not free, are you? A cage with gilded bars is still a cage." The boys said nothing. Yet Moreau felt a strange compassion fill his chest. Not for the painting, but for the child beneath it, the real one, long gone and perhaps never at rest. A boy sacrificed by a father's obsession, trapped by an artist's ambition, then animated by years of grief and legal fascination, and now passed as inheritance, a smile as testament, a contract sealed not by law but by consequence. He unscrewed a small bottle of alcohol, dipped a clean rag, and wiped the section of the frame where the frost had formed. Beneath it, the wood gleamed, warm, even living. That was enough. Someone, Fontana, Lefebvre, perhaps even the widow, had fed the canvas more than pigment, layer upon layer of substance, of breath, of bone, of oil. He returned the rag to his pocket. He did not destroy the painting. It had already destroyed itself, or everything around it, which was the same thing. What he did instead was close the shutters and walk out. Outside, snow had stopped, allowing the shape of the vineyards to re-emerge, no longer rows of the dead, but furrows marking the land's stubborn refusal to forget what had grown in it. He ordered the portrait to be transferred to the archives in Paris, sealed in a climate-controlled room far from airs, fires, and chapels. He signed the final papers with a hand that no longer trembled. The estate would pass to the state. The Valcourt line, like many before it, would dissolve into rumour. When he finally left the chateau, the butler bowed once, deeply, as though burying not just a master, but a myth. Léonie watched from the corridor, her face unreadable. She did not wave. Some people belong to the house until the house lets them go. As the carriage rolled away, the road behind him narrowed into a single line, then vanished beneath the melt. Moreau leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the motion carry him. He did not dream. Or if he did, it was in the language of rooms, forgetting their history, paint drying on stillness, children stepping out of frames not to haunt, but to rest. Paris awaited with its smoke and cold lamps and endless births of scandal. But for now the inspector's cigarette flared once in the morning air, a single ember burning away with the last of the varnish's truth. The boy on the canvas had smiled. The world, eventually, would learn to look away,